most vehement attacks were coming from people who don't have children in our school district. Many of them don't even live in our school district.
Fear consistently proves itself as one of the most powerful motivators in politics. This latest scare around the supposed communist takeover of schools in America is no different. Following the nationwide uprising against racism, conservative politicians manufactured a wedge issue they call critical race theory, or CRT for short, which claims that there's a secret plot to indoctrinate the nation's youth with left-wing ideologies. The CRT scare explains away the reality of a country slowly reckoning with over 400 years of unaddressed exploitation and genocide as a much more ominous-sounding conspiracy, an explanation that has re-energized the conservative base following Donald Trump's defeat in 2020. Dozens of Republicans running in midterm elections have made banning CRT a central platform point to try to capitalize on this wave of fear. You may have seen videos of conservative parents storming school board meetings, accusing teachers of brainwashing their children with obscene material, singing the national anthem when they don't get their way, and even throwing up the Nazi salute at times. Conservative media has been quick to call this an organic grassroots movement, but is it? What conservative pundits leave out is that there's a vast array of conservative super PACs, billionaires, and dark money slush funds that have been quietly funneling millions of dollars into these seemingly grassroots campaigns to turn once quiet local school board meetings into the front lines of the Republican war on school curricula. In Lake Travis, Texas, a super PAC called the South Lake Families PAC, which raised nearly $400,000, mounted a successful special election campaign to instate a conservative majority on the South Lake School Board. This anti-CRT group, which claims to be, quote, rooted in Judeo-Christian values, spent almost $100,000 on campaign consulting and lawyers, over $50,000 on printing, and thousands of dollars on Facebook ads. Over a quarter of this money came from just 35 wealthy donors making donations over $1,000. In Douglas County, Colorado, a conservative PAC called the 1776 Project PAC, a group that believes it's fighting a Marxist takeover of public schools, propelled 4 self-branded conservatives to victory by soliciting donations from wealthy donors that amounted to over 3 times what their opponent had raised. To put that in perspective, that's almost 7 times the amount of money spent in the 2015 election. In San Francisco, conservatives called a recall election for 3 San Francisco school board members over COVID policies and proposed school renamings. A super PAC set up to support the recall quickly raised over $1 million, almost half of which came from one man, a 95-year-old childless billionaire named Arthur Rock. Another PAC, Neighbors for a Better San Francisco, which threw in another $500,000, is heavily funded by William Oberndorf, another billionaire who co-founded an organization dedicated to undermining public schools with his billionaire friend, Betsy DeVos. To understand where this all came from, we spoke to Jeffrey Hennig, professor of education at Columbia University and co-author of the book Outside Money in School Board Elections, The Nationalization of Education Politics. Obviously, a central theme in these battles over school board elections has been the way history is being taught. You had the chairman of the Republican Study Committee actually circulated a memo encouraging Republicans to, quote, lean into the culture war. You have several Republican candidates running in midterm elections using these cultural issues, especially running against CRT as a main platform point. So what is the significance of the sort of politicization and nationalization of local school board politics?
What's happening now is these culture war issues are being strategically played upon by national actors who see them important, not in terms of necessarily education policy per se, but national politics. And a big part of this is thinking about the upcoming midterm elections. For Republicans and conservatives, there's a sense that these are issues that can help them do a couple of things. One is win back suburban voters, some of whom abandoned the party because they were turned off by Trump or some of the rhetoric of Trump, the personality of Trump, a whole bunch of things where suburbs swung back to the Democrats. And this is an issue that suburban families care about. And the other thing is just to mobilize voters. A big part of winning elections is getting people to the polls, and this is an issue that Republicans, I'm not sure that they foresaw this, but they're seeing it happen and they're responding to it and trying to take advantage of it, that this is the kind of thing that draws people out who normally aren't paying all that much attention, not just to school board elections, but to politics in general. But they're revved up and they're energized, and these national actors are hoping they can convert that into votes across the board in November.
Well, these school board disruptions and decontextualized videos have only fueled the right wing's feeling of victimhood. School board members in these districts paint a far different picture. We spoke to school board members who were attacked by these conservative mobs to get their side of the story.
There were a couple of incidents. One where my lawn sign was seen in an informal shooting range with bullets holes in it and target stickers on it. And the second was an individual saying things that were really concerning to a friend of mine in town. And those two threats or concerns were shared with local law enforcement. They responded to it. And I found the support locally to make sure I'm safe.
We had a number of board members who were terrified. They ended up getting security systems for their homes. And they were really scared. We ended up having to have security resource officers at all of our board meetings. We had one board meeting that was literally overwhelmed by folks who stormed in and did not want the meeting to go forward. They were shouting over the board. They were screaming the Lord's Prayer in order to disrupt the meeting.
I think there are a lot of people who might be watching what's happening from a distance. They're seeing things on TV, they're hearing about CRT in the media, and they think to themselves, wow, if there's all this anger, there must be something there. So what can you say about what's being taught in your schools?
I don't think it was really about education, because they don't know what's being taught. They hadn't looked at our website. They hadn't talked to our students. They hadn't talked with our teachers. We have a Google Classroom for our elementary kids where lessons are posted online. Most teachers post the assignments that kids are working on online. So it's easy to get that information. But I think that some of the folks that are showing up angry about what they say we're doing are simply being misinformed by some group who have convinced them that our schools are lying to them. And it is really difficult, again, to have a reasonable discussion with people who have already made up their mind about what the truth is, because you can show them the truth. I had a conversation with one mother about a children's book that she had found, she thought was in our library. It turns out it wasn't, but she said it was pornographic and it was sexually explicit. And I asked her if she'd read it, and she said no. Well, I found it, and it was a lovely little book about a child who had a really close relationship with her uncle. And she was sad because her uncle was getting married. And she was afraid that because her uncle loved somebody else, he wouldn't love her anymore. And it was just this sweet book with her conversation with her uncle saying, I'm always going to love you. You're always going to be important to me. Our hearts are big enough to love a lot of people. And it just so happened that her uncle was marrying a man. But that had nothing to do with the theme of the book. And I'm thinking in terms of being sexually explicit. Well, the woman that I had this conversation with said she would never open the cover because it was just too pornographic. But that's the kind of heartbreaking conversation that I've never had with folks until recently, because they've made up their minds, and I think it's almost like they've been brainwashed, and they're not interested in hearing what's actually happening in our schools.